after 4 years in office, John Adams was up for re-election in 1800. 1800 is one of the, if not the most important election in all of U.S. history. And every election you hear people say, this is the most important. And in this case, it really is. The candidates in 1800 were almost identical to what they'd been in 1796. Republicans had Thomas Jefferson running for president, and Aaron Burr was supposed to be running for vice president, Aaron Burr of New York. But they couldn't specify whether they were going to be president or vice president because of the way the Electoral College originally worked. For the Federalists, it was John Adams again. The only different candidate was the vice presidential candidate. Instead of Thomas Pinckney, it was his brother, Charles Pinckney. And the one reason this is such an important election is because you had two parties with two vastly different views of the United States and what the United States should be. And this is so early in America's history that whichever side wins, they will take the country in a vastly different direction. So the partisanship was intensely high all throughout the country. And I know in 2021, partisanship is really high. It was, I don't know if it's worse in 1800, but it was really probably worse. 2021 is really bad, but 1800, it was really bad as well. And they had two vastly different views of what the United States should be. The Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, believed in a strong national government. They wanted the government to be big, and they wanted it to be powerful. Federalists believed in control by the elite. They believed that there were certain people in society that were just inherently better and more elite, and anyone with a view like that joined the Federalist Party. Federalists also favored a balanced economy. So the United States is overwhelmingly agricultural. When I say overwhelmingly, we're talking about the vast majority, 90%. The vast majority of the country is agricultural. Federalists wanted to use the government to advance policies to make the United States economy more advanced, more like England's. Also, Federalists wanted a big military. Militaries make the country more powerful, and Federalists said the United States needed to be more powerful, needed to have a bigger military so it could contend with the European nations, especially England and France. The strength was in the northeast, because that's where most of the financial centers are, most of commerce, manufacturing, and banking. The Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, wanted a limited government. They wanted a small government that wasn't going to that was going to have a very limited role in people's lives, and they called for majority rule. And so the Republican rhetoric was much more for a more democratic, egalitarian system. And now, even among the founders, the word democracy meant mob rule a lot of the time. So they weren't using democracy the way we use it today. But they wanted a more equitable, they called for a society in which, say majority rule, more people have the right to vote and participate in politics. The Republicans favored an agricultural-based society, so if the government doesn't do anything, the United States would stay a predominantly agricultural society for a lot longer. It's an interesting, the agricultural part's interesting because even in 1800, agricultural-based societies, they were not powerful, and also they're very stratified. You had a small group in agricultural-based society that had, that were planters in America, and everyone else was fairly poor. So it's not like it is actually necessarily a more fair, balanced society. Agricultural societies tend to be very stratified. They were also very much against a large standing military. And that's because large militaries and oppressive governments always go together, especially monarchies. That's how monarchs oppress their population, is a big military. So Jefferson and Madison, they really opposed a large standing military in 1800. They will be very pro-French, and their strength is in the South and the West. So you had two parties that were calling for very different views of the United States and what the United States should be. Now, if you remember in 1796, Hamilton, he tried to interfere to get Thomas Pinckney to be president, and that backfired on him. Would he do that again? Of course he would. So Hamilton, he went even further in 1800. He wrote a 56-page letter explaining why Adams was horrible, and 56 pages of just ripping on Adams, and sent it off to several Federalist electors. When Hamilton goes in a room and closes the door with the pen and paper, everyone knows something big is going to come out. It's like a bomb. It's like Kanye and his tweets. Train wreck. Hamilton sent this to electors all throughout the country, Federalist electors. And of course it got into the hands of Republicans. Republicans used that, and Republicans were united. So when the votes were counted, some Federalist electors held their votes back from Adams, one from the South. Some Federalists in the North held their votes back from Pinckney. And so neither Pinckney or Adams were in the top, made the first two positions. And the Republicans were so united that every one of the electors voted for Jefferson and Burr, so there was a tie. And this is a problem because, according to the Constitution at the time, whoever gets the first amount of votes is president, second most is vice president, but it didn't say anything about a tie. So, according to the Constitution, the election now went to the House of Representatives. We've only had a few elections decided in the House of Representatives, and this is the first one. And the way it works in the House of Representatives is, no matter how big your state is, every state gets one vote for who it wants to be president, based on your members of the House of Representatives. So there were 16 states in the country at the time, 8 controlled by Federalists, 8 controlled by Republicans, and when they cast the first ballot, it was a tie. All the states controlled by Republicans voted for Jefferson. All the states that were controlled by Federalists voted for Burr. Not because they liked Burr, because they didn't. Well, they liked Burr. A lot of them liked Burr more than Jefferson, since Burr was from the North. But it's because they thought they could just keep Jefferson from the presidency by supporting Burr. What Burr should have done here is recuse himself and said, I was meant to be vice president, so even if I win, I'm going to drop out. But he didn't do that because he truly thought that he could be president. And Burr was a dangerous man. He was power hungry. And he was only interested in himself and benefiting himself. Unlike all the other founding fathers, all the other ones, they would disagree with each other, but they all tried to have character. Burr didn't even try. This got to be insanely dangerous. When I say insanely dangerous, I mean they voted 34 more times, and every time it was tied 8-8. Inauguration now is January 20th. That'll change in the 1930s. Back then, it was March 4th. And it started getting close to March 4th, and they could not break this deadlock. Now, to make a very complicated story short, if it kept going, Federalists would maintain control of the government. And it looked like, to a lot of Federalists, that's what they were going to do. They were going to try to make sure Republicans didn't win by keeping the House in a deadlock. This got insanely dangerous. It got so dangerous that in Virginia and Pennsylvania surrounding Washington, D.C., the governors called out the state militia in preparation to send the militia into Washington, D.C. in case there was a fight or to force Jefferson into the presidency. Federalists were trying to block a fair election from happening using electoral tactics that were obviously just to maintain power. This is what happens in most countries. Most countries in the world, when there's a democratic election, one side will end up pulling out their guns, or one side, the side that's in power, they will refuse to leave office, and it descends into a bloodbath. That's the norm throughout world history. Throughout most of the world, in most places, if you control the government and you abuse that government ruthlessly, you do not give it up. That's why if you look at Russia right now, what Vladimir Putin is doing, this got to be so dangerous. It looked like there was going to be violence, that something had to stop it. Someone had to step in, and the person that stepped in was Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton, the leader of the Federalist Party, he had known Aaron Burr for a long time. They had always been cordial with each other. They had always gotten along just fine. But Hamilton knew Burr. He understood who Burr was and what Burr was like. And so Hamilton came in on the side of Thomas Jefferson, his mortal political enemy. The two men that were the most dissimilar politically, probably in the whole United States. Hamilton stepped in on the side of Jefferson, and he started sending letters to all the Federalist electors saying, "For heaven's sake, let not the Federal Party be responsible for the elevation of this man. If there be a man in the world I ought to hate, it is Jefferson, but the public good must be paramount to every private consideration." Hamilton said, look, Jefferson's principles are wrong, but he has principles. Burr has no principles. Burr doesn't stand for anything. And Burr didn't stand for anything except himself. So Hamilton put a lot of pressure on a lot of politicians, and in the state of Virginia only had one member of the House of Representatives. He was the one that switched his votes. On the 35th ballot, he switched his vote to Thomas Jefferson, and so Jefferson won on the 35th ballot. The reason the election of 1800 is so important, the reason you have to know it, is a couple things. First and foremost, because of the election of 1800, that is why we get the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment says that each elector will specify who they are voting for president and who they are voting for vice president, and they'll be on the same ballot. What the 12th Amendment is essentially doing is it's the Founding Fathers acknowledging we are going to have parties, and we need to create an electoral system that shows we will have parties. Again, the original intent was for no parties to form, but they had to be honest with themselves and say, okay, this is happening. So the 12th Amendment, that is the acknowledgement that the United States was going to have parties. And so it's also just the first example of the United States changing its electoral system. So the electoral system has changed many times. This is the first one, and this is a major one. The other reason the election of 1800 is so important, and this is even more important, is it is the first peaceful transfer of power in U.S. history. Up until this point, Federalists had controlled the presidency. Washington, he was above politics, but all of his policies were Federalist policies. So he wasn't a partisan Federalist, but he was a Federalist in his policies. Again, the norm throughout world history is when a party is in power for a long time, if they lose an election, they will not give it up. That's what happens in most places in the world. If you are going to have a democratic government, when there is an election, you have one party, the party that lost, has to give up power without bloodshed, and that's what the Federalists did. Federalists were not happy about it. They tried to tamper the election a little bit, but the good sense of a majority overcame that, and they managed to have a peaceful transfer of power. And again, this set the precedent for the United States. And precedence is so important, but after this, we will have a lot of contested elections, we will have a lot of dirty elections, and there are some exceptions, but we have had a peaceful transfer of power. 1860 doesn't count. We'll get to 1860 later. 1876 is an exception where there was almost violence. 2020 is also an exception. Would not believe how many of my lectures have been screwed up by 2020 and 2021. 2020 is one of the first times, never had a party actively try to undo the results of a democratic, fair election. And when anyone tells you that what we're living through is just politics as usual, they are factually incorrect. What you are living through is historic. What we are living through now will make textbooks someday. And this is the first one. And if you're going to have a representative democracy, you have got to have a peaceful transfer of power. Now, after Jefferson came into office, Jefferson did several things. He called it the Revolution of 1800. He said this was a revolution. Well, revolution of violent upheaval of the status quo. Was it a revolution? Make sure you read about this in your notes. He will call it a revolution, but then he is very conciliatory. Say we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, because he does what presidents are supposed to do and bring the whole country together and unify them. Try to unify them. Put an olive branch out. Some people thought he was going to get rid of all Federalists in government and replace them with Republicans, and he didn't. That's called the spoil system. And make sure you know this, he did not use the spoil system. A lot of Republicans were very upset at him, but he kept a lot of Federalists in their positions. And he brought some Federalists into the government, ones that were capable. So he did not use the spoil system. But what he did do was reorient the federal government. When I say reorient, I mean he genuinely cut it down. He didn't get rid of the Bank of the United States, which he had opposed. He didn't undo funding and assumption because they were just working so well that he couldn't. But what he did do was, one, and this is important to know, he cut all taxes. He cut all taxes, and so the United States made all of its money from tariffs, or custom duties, and also sale of land. The government owns all the land, so when it can sell it. And so that's where all the money was coming from. He cut all taxes. And make sure you understand this. If he's going to cut all the taxes, he has got to cut the military down. Because you can have a small government. You cannot have a large, huge military and a small government. Those two things don't go together. And he really cut the military down. He made the military as small as he possibly could. Instead of having a navy, he said the United States would be protected by a mosquito fleet, which is small little boats that would just patrol the coastline. And he got rid of the military as much as he possibly could. He cut it by more than half. And he cut the budget for the entire military. What you need to know is Thomas Jefferson's presidency is the smallest the government has ever been in U.S. history. So he will get exactly what he wanted. He doesn't change the fundamentals of the United States representative democracy and capitalism, but he does reorient the government to make it significantly smaller. And during his presidency, we will get to see the government the smallest it has ever been. He will also make sure you know those things because they will come up again later. No taxes and cutting down the military. He'll also say he wants to get rid of the debt, but he does not succeed at that. We'll get to that in a minute. This also ushered in what's called the Republican dynasty. Beginning with Thomas Jefferson in 1800, we will have 24 straight years of control by Southern planter Republicans. Thomas Jefferson for 8 years, James Madison for 8 years, then James Monroe for 8 years. So Southern planters will dominate so much of U.S. history in the first, throughout this class. George Washington was, Thomas Jefferson, and Madison, Monroe. They're all Southern planters. And the United States will become more democratic under these administrations. So it started out as a very elite-controlled government, but over time it will become more democratic. And a lot of that happens under the Republican dynasty. One other thing Jefferson had to deal with at the very beginning of his presidency was a problem with the federal judiciary, the judiciary branch, the court system. Because Federalists had controlled the government since the very beginning at this point, judges throughout the country were Federalists, and they're appointed for life. So make sure you read the note about the federal judiciary. Federalists tried to cram more people into the judiciary, more and more Federalists, so they could have complete control of that one branch. So make sure you read about it. Two things that you should know. First and foremost, one of the last things Adams did before he left office was appoint to the Supreme Court the most important Chief Justice we've ever had in this country. And every court is named after the Chief Justice. So this is the Marshall Court. John Marshall will be Chief Justice from 1801 to 1835. That's why when on a game show, when it says when people are asked who's the first Chief Justice, I've heard a lot of people say Marshall because he is so much more important than John Jay was. Marshall is the second Chief Justice, and he will completely change the court system in this country. John Marshall, during that entire period, he will work to expand the power of the federal government. Because Marshall, he is an all-out Federalist, and that's why also Marshall is related to Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson and John Marshall were related to each other, but they hated each other, really, really despised each other. And Marshall on the court will continuously expand the power of the courts. Make sure you know the name John Marshall. Other thing you need to know from the beginning, from Jefferson's struggle with the judiciary, is the most important Supreme Court case in all of U.S. history, Marbury v. Madison. Marbury v. Madison is a very complicated case that involved a Federalist named William Marbury that John Adams tried to shove into a position. It's very complicated, but Madison was supposed to give Marbury his commission or contract for a job, and he wouldn't do it, so it ended up in a court fight. And to make a really complicated story really short, because court cases are insanely complicated, Marshall ruled a part of an act unconstitutional. He took away a power of the Supreme Court's, a power the Supreme Court had. And it's very complicated. It's called a writ of mandamus. You don't need to know that. But Marbury ruled that unconstitutional. So who cares? And this is why lawyers get paid so much, because it's so complicated. The reason it matters was because when Marshall ruled one part of one law unconstitutional, it was the first time in Western civilization a court had ruled an act of any legislature unconstitutional. It wasn't even a whole act. It was a part of one act that was ruled unconstitutional. What Marshall did here was make the Supreme Court the final interpreter of the Constitution. In Marbury v. Madison, he is making it so now the Supreme Court will get to say what is and is not constitutional. Remember, the Constitution does not say who has the power to be its final interpreter. With Marbury v. Madison, Marshall says it is the court system. The Supreme Court of the United States will be the final interpreter of the Constitution. It's called judicial review, the power of the judiciary to review the Constitution and the acts of the legislature and the acts of the president. It is the most important power for who gets to interpret the laws in this country. And when I say it's the most important court case in all of U.S. history, I mean, they literally etched it into the side of the Supreme Court building. It's literally etched in stone. Judicial review was established, and it is the right thing for the United States. It's got to be the Supreme Court that interprets the Constitution. Presidents change too frequently, and there will still be some people that say it should be the states, but we'll get to that. It is the one court case you absolutely must know, Marbury v. Madison.